In 1979, one of the most dramatic political upheavals of the 20th century reshaped an ancient civilization overnight. A powerful monarchy, backed by oil wealth, a fearsome secret police, and the full support of the United States, collapsed in a matter of weeks. A 76-year-old cleric who had spent years in exile returned to a country of 37 million people and, without holding a single elected office, became the most powerful man in Iran. What followed was not simply a change of government. It was a total transformation of society, its laws, its culture, its relationships with women, with religion, with the outside world, and with its own identity. This is the story of Iran's transformation after the revolution. A story of idealism and terror, of sacrifice and repression, of a nation that remade itself in fire, and has never stopped arguing about what it became. The world that vanished. Iran before and during the revolution. To understand what Iran became, you must first understand what it was, and why so many of its people were willing to burn it down. By the 1970s, Iran under Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi was a country of stark contradictions. On the surface, it looked like a modernizing success story. Tehran had skyscrapers, luxury hotels, and a growing middle class. Iranian women attended universities, wore mini-skirts on the streets of the capital, and held professional positions in law, medicine, and education. The country's oil revenues, supercharged by the 1973 price shock, were funding ambitious industrialization programs. The Shah spoke openly of transforming Iran into a great civilization, a regional superpower that would rival Western Europe within a generation. But beneath the glittering surface, the contradictions were explosive. Iran's rapid modernization had been imposed from above, often violently, without democratic participation. The Shah's secret police, SAVAK, trained partly by the CIA and Israel's Mossad, monitored, arrested, tortured, and disappeared political opponents across the ideological spectrum. Communists, nationalists, Islamists, and liberals alike filled the prisons. Estimates of political prisoners in the late 1970s range from several thousand to over 100,000, depending on the source. The White Revolution of 1963, the Shah's package of top-down reforms that included land redistribution, women's suffrage, and literacy programs, had alienated traditional clergy and rural communities without fully winning over the urban poor. Rapid industrialization had drawn millions of villagers into cities, but urban infrastructure and social services could not keep up. A vast population of displaced, underemployed young men crowded into the shanty towns ringing Tehran, Tabriz, and Isfahan, disconnected from their traditional roots, resentful of an elite that seemed to grow richer while they struggled, and deeply suspicious of a westernization they experienced not as liberation, but as cultural assault. It was into this landscape that Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini had been speaking, first from Qom, then from exile in Iraq, then from a suburb of Paris for nearly 15 years. His message was not complicated. The Shah was a tyrant. The Americans and Israelis who propped him up were enemies of Islam and of Iran. Islam itself, properly understood, was not merely a religion of private devotion, but a complete system of government, law, and social organization. And the people of Iran had both the right and the duty to rise up. What made Khomeini uniquely dangerous to the Shah was his ability to speak across class lines. To the urban poor and the traditional bazaar merchants, he was a defender of authentic Iranian Islamic identity against Western cultural imperialism. To young leftists and intellectuals who hated the Shah's authoritarianism, he seemed, at least initially, a fellow revolutionary who might share power in a post-monarchic Iran. To the nationalists who remembered the CIA-backed coup of 1953 that had overthrown Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and restored the Shah, Khomeini represented a rejection of foreign interference. The revolutionary coalition that emerged in 1978 and early 1979 was, in retrospect, remarkably unstable. It included Marxists and devout Muslims, secular feminists and traditional clerics, liberal constitutionalists, and radical Islamists. What they shared was the desire to bring down the Shah. What they would do afterward was a question most preferred not to examine too closely. The revolution itself unfolded with breathtaking speed. Through 1978, massive strikes paralyzed the oil industry, the lifeblood of the Iranian economy, and street demonstrations grew from tens of thousands to millions. In September 1978, on what became known as Black Friday, security forces opened fire on demonstrators in Tehran's JLA Square. Estimates of the dead range from dozens to several hundred. The massacre did not break the movement, it hardened it. The Shah, weakened by cancer and torn between brutal repression and last-minute concession, proved unable to do either effectively. On January 16, 1979, Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi left Iran for the last time, officially on vacation. He would never return, dying in exile in Egypt in July 1980. On February 1, 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini stepped off an Air France flight at Tehran's Mehrabad airport, greeted by a crowd that some estimates placed at 5 million people. When a journalist on the plane asked him how he felt about returning to Iran after 15 years in exile, Khomeini replied with a single word that would prove, in retrospect, deeply revealing: nothing. The revolution had won. The question of what it had won, and for whom, was about to be answered in ways that would horrify many of those who had made it. In the months after the revolution's triumph, the coalition that had united against the Shah began to fracture at terrifying speed. Khomeini moved decisively to consolidate clerical power, the concept he had developed over years of lectures and writings. Velayat-e, or guardianship of the Islamic jurist, held that in the absence of the hidden imam, a figure central to Shia theology, supreme political authority should rest with the most qualified Islamic scholar. In practice, that meant Khomeini himself. It was a revolutionary doctrine within Shia Islam, and not all senior clerics accepted it. Grand Ayatollah Kazem Shariatmadari, one of the most respected religious figures in Iran, publicly opposed Velayat-e, arguing that clerics should guide but not govern. He was eventually placed under house arrest, where he died in 1986. His fate sent an unmistakable message about the price of theological dissent. By the spring and summer of 1979, the revolutionary tribunals were already at work. Hundreds of figures from the old regime, generals, ministers, civic officers, were tried in proceedings that lasted minutes and executed by firing squad. The executions were not merely acts of vengeance. They were also deliberate dismantlings of the institutional structures of the old state, ensuring that any counter-revolutionary effort would have no military or administrative core to rally around. The liberal and leftist allies who had fought alongside the Islamists began to understand, too late, that they were not partners in a shared revolution. They were material being used to accomplish a revolution that would then be turned against them. The Islamic Republic takes shape, law, society, and a consolidation of clerical power. The constitution that emerged from the revolution was unlike any document Iran or the world had seen before. Ratified by referendum in December 1979, the Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran created a hybrid system that combined elements of democratic representation with supreme clerical authority. There would be an elected president, an elected parliament, and a judiciary. But above all of them stood the supreme leader, the Velayat-e, whose authority derived not from votes, but from Islamic jurisprudence, and whose powers were, in practice, nearly unlimited. Khomeini became the first supreme leader, a position he would hold until his death in 1989. Beneath him, the Guardian Council, 12 jurists, 6 appointed by the supreme leader, was empowered to veto any legislation it deemed inconsistent with Islamic law or the Constitution. The Revolutionary Guards, the Pastoran, became a parallel military force loyal not to the state in the conventional sense, but to the revolution and its ideological principles, with their own army, navy, air force, and eventually a vast economic empire that would make them one of the most powerful institutions in Iranian society. The transformation of Iranian law was rapid and comprehensive. Family law, which had been substantially reformed under the Shah's 1967 Family Protection Law, was reversed almost immediately. The marriage age for girls was lowered, in the initial revolutionary codes, to 9 lunar years, a figure drawn from classical Islamic jurisprudence and one that sparked controversy even among some clerics. The age was later raised to 13 and eventually to 15 with judicial permission for younger cases. Men were given unilateral rights to divorce and to take multiple wives. Women who had been judges under the old system were removed from the bench. Under the new system's interpretation of Islamic law, women could not serve as judges in the same capacity. The hijab, Islamic head covering, was made compulsory for women in public. This was not announced as a gradual policy suggestion. On March 8, 1979, International Women's Day, tens of thousands of women marched in Tehran to protest the new dress codes and other signs that the revolution was moving in a direction its female participants had not anticipated. The marches were disrupted by Islamist counter-protesters. Within weeks, the requirement for hijab in government workplaces was formalized, and over the following years it became universally enforced in all public spaces. The reaction among Iranian women was not monolithic. For many women from traditional religious backgrounds, the hijab was not an imposition but an expression of identity, something they had always worn by choice and now wore with pride as citizens of an Islamic republic. For secular and educated women who had lived differently under the Shah, the mandatory veil was experienced as a profound violation of personal autonomy, a visible sign that the revolution had not been made for them. The purging of universities, a process the new government called the Cultural Revolution, began in 1980. Universities were closed for 2 to 3 years, their curricula overhauled, their faculties screened for ideological reliability. Thousands of professors, deemed too westernized, too leftist, or insufficiently Islamic, were dismissed. When the universities reopened, the social sciences and humanities had been particularly reshaped. Islamic studies expanded dramatically, and the admissions process now included assessments of applicants' religious commitment and ideological correctness. The press was rapidly brought under control. Newspapers that had flourished briefly during the revolutionary period, secular, leftist, liberal publications that had imagined themselves partners in the new Iran, found themselves shut down, their editors arrested, their presses seized. By 1980, Iran's media landscape had been comprehensively reshaped into one dominated by state-controlled outlets that served the ideological priorities of the Islamic Republic. The political elimination of the left was completed with particular thoroughness. The Mojahedin-e Khalq, MEK, an organization that had combined Islamist theology with Marxist guerrilla theory and had fought against the Shah, initially supported the revolution and then turned against Khomeini when it became clear there would be no power sharing. Beginning in June 1981, after a bombing that killed senior Islamic Republic officials, the state launched a campaign of mass arrests and executions against the MEK and the broader left. Thousands were executed in the following years. The MEK relocated its leadership to Iraq, where it would subsequently fight alongside Saddam Hussein against Iran in the Iran-Iraq War, a decision that permanently destroyed any remaining domestic legitimacy it might have had. The Tudeh Party, Iran's Communist Party, which had fatally miscalculated by supporting Khomeini in the belief that clerical populism and anti-imperialism made him a useful ally, was destroyed in 1983. Its leadership was arrested, forced to make televised confessions, and in many cases executed. The left, which had contributed enormously to the intellectual and organizational groundwork of the revolution, was eliminated from the political arena with a thoroughness it would not begin to recover from for decades. What remained was not simply a theocracy in the sense of clerics running a traditional state. It was something new, a revolutionary ideology that used Islamic law as its vocabulary, but whose energy came from the same 20th century sources: mass mobilization, propaganda, utopia transformation, the willingness to use systematic violence in service of a total vision, as the other great revolutionary projects of the era. It was, in many ways, a Shia Islamist version of the revolutionary state, complete with its own martyrology, its own ideological organs, its own security apparatus, and its own internal factional struggles between hardliners and reformists that would play out across the following decades. War, martyrdom, and the making of a revolutionary culture. On September 22, 1980, Iraqi forces under Saddam Hussein crossed the international border into Iran along a front stretching hundreds of kilometers, beginning a conflict that would last 8 years, consume an estimated 1 million lives, and shape Iranian society more profoundly than almost any other single event of the 20th century. Saddam had calculated, not unreasonably from a strategic standpoint, that the Islamic Republic was vulnerable. The revolutionary purges had devastated the Iranian military's officer corps. Hundreds of generals and senior commanders had been executed, imprisoned, or driven into exile. The army's equipment, much of it American-supplied and dependent on American technical support that had evaporated with the revolution, was struggling. Iran was internationally isolated after the seizure of the U.S. Embassy in November 1979 and the hostage crisis that followed. Arab Gulf states, alarmed by Khomeini's calls for Islamic revolution to spread across the region, were quietly supportive of Saddam's adventure. The United States, furious about the hostages and fearful of Iranian revolutionary contagion, was at minimum indifferent and would soon begin actively assisting Iraq with intelligence and, eventually, with the turning of a blind eye toward Iraqi use of chemical weapons. Saddam's calculation proved catastrophically wrong. The invasion did not shatter the Islamic Republic, it saved it. The external threat fused the nation in a way that internal ideology alone might never have accomplished. The war gave the revolution its most powerful legitimizing narrative: Iran as a nation of martyrs, attacked by an aggressor backed by the godless superpowers, defending its soil and its Islamic revolution with its blood. The human wave tactics employed in the early years of the war have been among the most debated and disturbing aspects of the conflict. Facing a severe shortage of trained officers and sophisticated equipment, Iranian commanders in some cases sent waves of poorly armed volunteers, including, in early phases, very young men and boys recruited through revolutionary networks and mosques, across minefields to clear the way for regular forces. The phenomenon of child soldiers in the Iran-Iraq War is historically documented, though the scale and the role of official policy versus local initiative remains a subject of scholarly debate. What is not disputed is that young men were recruited with intense religious fervor, told that martyrdom in defense of the Islamic Republic was the highest honor, and given plastic keys to paradise to wear around their necks as they went into battle. The Basij, the People's Militia, founded by Khomeini in 1979, became the organizational vehicle for mass mobilization of volunteer fighters. Young men, many from poor rural and urban backgrounds for whom the revolution had represented a genuine shift in social dignity and opportunity, volunteered in enormous numbers. The Basij were not cannon fodder in the purely cynical sense sometimes implied. Many were genuinely motivated by religious conviction, patriotic duty, and the social bonds of their local mosques and communities. But they were deployed in ways that resulted in catastrophic casualties. The war forged a culture of martyrdom that became central to the Islamic Republic's self-presentation and continues to shape Iranian public life. The concept of Shaheed, martyr, was not new to Shia Islam. It lay at the very heart of the tradition, rooted in the death of Imam Hussein at Karbala in 680 CE. But the Islamic Republic systematized and bureaucratized martyrdom on an industrial scale. Martyr cemeteries, Beheshti Zura outside Tehran being the largest, became sites of pilgrimage and state ceremony. Streets, schools, hospitals, and public squares were renamed for martyrs. Murals depicting fallen fighters in vivid, almost Byzantine iconographic style spread across the walls of Iranian cities, where many remain today. The war's fronts shifted dramatically across its 8 years. Iran recovered much of its lost territory through 1981 and 1982, including the critical port city of Khorramshahr in a brutal urban battle that became known in Iran as the City of Blood. The recapture of Khorramshahr in May 1982 was celebrated as a near-miraculous victory and gave Khomeini and the hardliners the political capital to reject Iraqi peace feelers and continue the war into Iraqi territory, a decision that has been criticized by historians as a catastrophic overreach that prolonged the conflict by 6 more years and hundreds of thousands of additional deaths. The war also shaped the Islamic Republic's relationship with its minorities in complex ways. Iran's Arab minority concentrated in the oil-rich southwestern province of Khuzestan, precisely where the Iraqi invasion struck, had been courted by Saddam as potential collaborators. Most Arab Iranians fought for Iran. Kurdish Iranians, who had risen in rebellion against the new Islamic Republic almost immediately after the revolution, faced simultaneous warfare against both the central government and, eventually, Iraqi forces, a multi-front tragedy that left deep scars. The war also accelerated the persecution of the Baha'i minority, who were excluded from official martyrdom status regardless of their sacrifices and faced systematic legal and social discrimination throughout the war period. The economy during the war years was one of severe strain and creative adaptation. Sanctions, the costs of the conflict, and the disruption of oil infrastructure drove inflation and shortages. Rationing became a feature of daily life. The bazaar merchants and the revolutionary foundations, the boniads, large conglomerates that controlled assets seized from the old regime and managed them in the name of the revolution's social welfare goals, became the dominant economic actors, operating in a system that blended ideological imperatives with pragmatic survival. When the war finally ended in August 1988 with a ceasefire that Khomeini described as drinking poison, Iran had neither won nor lost in any conventional military sense. Iraq had not collapsed. Iran had not succeeded in liberating the Shia holy cities of Najaf and Karbala as the maximalists had dreamed. The borders returned almost exactly to where they had been in September 1980. But Iran was not the same country. A generation had been scarred. The population had swelled, with the birth rate having surged during the revolutionary and early war years. The economy was battered, and the political system was poised for a reckoning over what exactly all the blood had been for. After Khomeini, reform, repression, and the unresolved revolution. On June 3, 1989, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini died of a heart attack in Tehran. The Islamic Republic had survived its founder's death, but the question of what it would become without him was deeply open. The succession had been arranged with revealing haste. Ali Khamenei, who had served 2 terms as president but was not considered a senior religious authority, his clerical rank was relatively modest, was elevated by the assembly of experts to become the new supreme leader. His relatively weak religious credentials compared to Khomeini would prove, over time, to be a feature rather than a buff from the perspective of hardline political factions. A supreme leader who owed his position to political appointment rather than towering scholarly authority was easier to manage and more dependent on the institutional structures of the Islamic Republic. Alongside Khamenei's elevation, Ali Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani became president, a position that had been restructured to absorb the role of prime minister, becoming significantly more powerful. The Rafsanjani era, from 1989 to 1997, was characterized by pragmatic economic reconstruction, cautious social relaxation, and continued authoritarian political control. The Boniads expanded their economic power. A limited opening to foreign investment was attempted. The social codes were enforced somewhat less zealously in practice, even as they remained on the books. The massive demographic bulge of the revolutionary generation, millions of young people born in the early 1980s, was growing up and would soon become a force that could not be ignored. The election of Mohammad Khatami to the presidency in 1997 was a genuine political earthquake. Khatami, a mid-ranking cleric with a philosophy background and a warm, inclusive manner, ran on a platform of civil society, rule of law, and what he called a dialogue of civilizations. He was expected to lose. He won with nearly 70% of the vote, drawing on overwhelming support from women, youth, and urban professionals who had been waiting for precisely this opportunity. The reform movement he led was the most serious internal challenge to the hardline interpretation of the Islamic Republic since the revolution's early years. What the reform era of 1997 to 2005 demonstrated, ultimately, was the limits of change within the system. Khatami's government opened newspapers, eased social restrictions, and engaged with the outside world. The response from the institutions of the deep state, the Revolutionary Guards, the judiciary, the Guardian Council, the parallel intelligence services, was systematic obstruction and repression. Reformist newspapers were shut down as fast as they opened. Journalists and intellectuals were imprisoned. Student protests were violently suppressed. In July 1999, student dormitories in Tehran were raided by Basij and vigilante groups, students beaten and thrown from windows. The protests that followed were crushed with arrests and exemplary sentences. Reformist members of parliament passed legislation that the Guardian Council vetoed. Khatami himself, committed to working within the system rather than confronting it, repeatedly backed down from direct confrontation with the supreme leader. The pattern would repeat. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad's presidency from 2005 to 2013 brought a sharp reversal, characterized by populist economics, aggressive nuclear rhetoric that brought unprecedented international sanctions, and social conservatism. His disputed re-election in June 2009 triggered the Green Movement, the largest street protests Iran had seen since the revolution itself. For weeks, millions of Iranians, wearing green as the color of the reform candidates Mir Hossein Mousavi and Mehdi Karoubi, filled the streets with a haunting question: where is my vote? The movement was crushed. Mousavi and Karoubi were placed under house arrest, where they remain as of the time of this production, and dozens of protesters were killed, hundreds imprisoned, and the movement's leaders subjected to show trials. Iran's nuclear program and its consequences for the country's relationship with the outside world wove through these decades as a constant undercurrent. The program, whose civilian origins dated to the Shah's era, was expanded covertly and became a central issue in Iran's geopolitics from the early 2000s onward. Whether Iran sought nuclear weapons or merely the capability to build them, what analysts call nuclear latency, became a question that drove international sanctions, covert operations, and repeated diplomatic crises. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, negotiated under President Hassan Rouhani, provided sanctions relief in exchange for limitations on Iran's nuclear activities. The U.S. withdrawal from the agreement in 2018 under President Donald Trump, followed by a maximum pressure sanctions campaign, devastated the Iranian economy and drove inflation and unemployment to punishing levels, strengthening hardliners who had always argued that negotiation with the West was futile. The election of Ebrahim Raisi to the presidency in 2021, in an election for which nearly all credible reform candidates had been disqualified by the Guardian Council, marked the most comprehensive consolidation of hardline power since the revolution's early years. Raisi's presidency was defined by economic hardship, continued repression, and the emergence of a protest movement that would prove the most significant since 2009. In September 2022, a 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman named Mahsa, Amini, died in the custody of Iran's morality police, who had detained her for allegedly violating the hijab regulations. Her death triggered nationwide protests under the slogan Woman, Life, Freedom, Jin, Azadi in Kurdish, that spread across every province of Iran and every sector of society. For months, Iranian women publicly removed their hijabs. Schoolgirls confronted officials. Workers struck. The protests were ultimately suppressed through mass arrests, over 15,000 detained, and at least several hundred killed. But the movement had demonstrated that Iran's social contract with its population had been strained to a degree the government could not simply ignore. What Iran's transformation after the revolution ultimately produced was a society in permanent, unresolved tension between a revolutionary ideology that claims legitimacy from God and from history, and a population, two-thirds of whom were born after the revolution, that increasingly wants something different. The Islamic Republic is neither as strong as it pretends, nor as fragile as its opponents hope. It has survived a devastating war, crushing sanctions, mass protests, and the death of its founder. It has also failed to fulfill the revolutionary promise of justice, freedom, and dignity that drove millions into the streets in 1979. The revolution has not ended. It has simply become the permanent condition.